Far too many golfers still think hitting 3-wood off the tee is a smart play, when in reality, it's just throwing away strokes. In this video, I'm going to explain to you why you need to be hitting driver off the tee consistently if you care at all about your scores. Now, before I explain all the math behind why you need to be hitting driver more, let me deal with all these silly straw man arguments I'm going to get in the comments. First, we are not endorsing hitting driver if driver is going to go through the fairway. If the driver is going to end up in the water, don't hit driver. If driver is going to end up in the bunker, hit 3-wood. If driver is going to end up in the trees, hit your 3-wood. Basically, if you're not hitting driver because it goes too far, that makes sense. You should hit your 3-wood. But that's specific to certain holes and certain designs. I would even say in some cases, if your driver always shapes in one direction and the 3-wood shapes the other direction, and you want to hit the 3-wood for that reason, that might be okay. But outside of those two scenarios, driver goes too far and you need the 3-wood for a certain shot shape, you should not be hitting 3-wood off the tee. Now I'm going to do one more thing before I get to the data, and that's explain why some of you are going to think I'm wrong. It's a real simple term from psychology called confirmation bias. I'm going to read the definition of confirmation bias for you. The tendency to interpret new evidence as confirmation of one's existing beliefs or theories. This isn't just about how you interpret evidence, it's about what you remember. If, for example, you believe that everyone who wears a pink shirt is a great golfer, every time you see a guy playing great golf in a pink shirt, you're going to lock that in. Your brain's going to remember it better. In this context, confirmation bias simply means that if you think hitting 3-wood is smart, every time you hit 3-wood and it turns out well, you're going to remember it. Conversely, every time you hit driver and it doesn't turn out well, you remember that. And your brain discards all the times that the driver stays in the fairway or the 3-wood doesn't work out. To avoid my own confirmation bias with this, I turned to ShotScope to get the real data behind the driver versus 3-wood debate. And they have millions of shots in their database, pulled from golfers of all handicap levels from all across the world. So I want to give a big thank you to ShotScope for doing the heavy lifting on the data for this video. The argument for hitting driver versus 3-wood comes down to two simple things. First, you do not want to give up distance. Second, driver is not meaningfully less accurate than your 3-wood. Let's dive into both. You do not want to give up distance. Distance is a major advantage in golf. I'm aware there are lots of cheeky little expressions like drive for show, putt for dough, mathematically disproven. And the woods are full of long hitters. But you know what else is full of long hitters? The PGA Tour, the list of people who've been #1 in the world. In golf, distance is a skill, and you should get as much of it as you can possibly get. Golfers get ridiculed for spending hundreds of dollars every year chasing 5 more yards off the tee, but it's actually a really sensible thing to do. Getting longer off the tee is one of the fastest ways to shoot lower scores. So let's get to the numbers. How much distance are people giving up on average when they hit 3-wood instead of driver off the tee? A scratch player is giving up 24 yards on average. A 25 handicap is giving up 26 yards on average. And the biggest gap is the 10 handicap. They're giving up 32 yards every time they opt for 3-wood instead of driver. And again, I'm going to keep saying this. This is over millions of shots. This is not some kind of small sample size theater where it's a couple golfers who are really long with their driver and bad at hitting their 3-wood and they're skewing this. This is millions of shots, tens of thousands of golfers. This is the real data. And I want to add something real important here. If you're saying, well, that's not me, I actually hit my 3-wood just as long as my driver, that's a you problem. That is a club fitting problem that you need to solve immediately. There is no reason in the world why this should go as far as this when this is bigger, it's got a hotter face, you can tee the ball up higher, create higher launch, lower spin. This should be going significantly longer than your 3-wood, and if it's not, again, that's a club fitting problem that you should be fixing immediately. If you had never seen golf before, you knew nothing about the game, and somebody asked you, do you want to be closer to the green or farther away if you were trying to shoot a low score? You would of course say closer. But unfortunately, all those dopey little rhymes and the adages and the conventional wisdom have clouded our brains from this very, very simple conclusion. We want to get as close to the green as we can all the time, in every situation outside of, again, water, hazards, etc., if we want to score our best. And thankfully, again, the data from ShotScope just shows us that as clear as can be. Let's start with the king of statistics, greens and regulation. I call greens and regulation the king of statistics because it is the one that correlates most closely with score. As greens and reg go up, your scores go down, and vice versa. For a 25 handicap, a player who is hitting only about 3 greens per round, their greens and reg go up 4% for every time they go down a club. Said another way, if they hit, say, 6% of greens with their 5-iron, just by switching to 6-iron, they're going to hit 10% of greens. They're going to get 4% more likely to hit the green because they went down a club. So let's add in the data from before. They switch from 3-wood to driver. They hit their tee shot 26 yards longer. They're going down at least 2 clubs, maybe 2.5. And so now they are at least 8% more likely to hit the green. That's effectively turning a 25 handicap into a 15. The benefits are very similar for a 15 handicap and a 5 handicap. 5 handicap players gain 4.8% more greens and reg for every club they drop down. And when they switch from 6-iron to 7-iron, that's when they get really excited because their greens and reg bump up an amazing 8%. 15 handicaps gain 5.2% more greens and reg every time they go down a club. So let's just wrap this up real simply here. When you hit driver off the tee, you hit it longer. When you hit it longer, you're going to be more likely to hit the green and reg. When you hit more greens and reg, you score better. If we just look at greens and reg by distance from the green, we can see a similar trend. Forget about the club they're hitting, just think about how far they are from the green. A 25 handicap player has a mere 1% chance of hitting the green from 175 yards to 200 yards. When they're in that range, pretty far from the green, it's almost impossible for them to get a green and reg. But bump them up to 150 to 175 yards, move them into that next 25-yard segment, and that percentage flies up to 8. Now they're hitting close to 1 in 10 greens instead of 1 in 100. On average, every time they move up 25 yards, and remember, they're giving up 26 yards by hitting 3-wood off the tee. Every time they move up 25 yards, they get 9.2% more likely to hit the green, and that advantage actually grows as they get closer. From 50 yards to 75 yards, they're hitting almost half their greens, where they're hitting only about a third from 75 to 100. So practically speaking, even on a short hole, 25 handicaps, and all of us, should be hitting driver and getting it as close as they possibly can. For the 15 handicaps, they're 8.6% more likely, on average, to hit the green every time they move up that 25 yards. And remember, they're giving up 32 yards by hitting 3-wood instead of driver. So they're absolutely going to see that 8.6% bump. 5 handicap players have that same 8.6% average jump every time they move up one 25-yard segment, but it's actually weighted a little further back. Those players are quite good when they get a wedge in their hands, but those longer approaches, when they take a long iron out of their hands and trade it for a mid iron, that's where they're going to see a lot more advantage. Their biggest advantage is from getting inside of 125 yards. From 100 yards to 125, they're hitting 55% of their greens, whereas from 125 to 150, that number is just 41%. Now, if you want something a little more high level, ShotScope also calculated for us the strokes to finish based on what club people used to hit their second shot approach. Across all handicaps, it shows that you will take fewer strokes to finish the shorter club you're hitting into the green. For the 5 handicap, every time they go down one club, their strokes to finish goes down by 0.06. That doesn't sound like a lot, but consider that every time they hit driver, they're getting about 2 clubs more distance off the tee, so they're dropping down 2 clubs, at least 2.5. So let's say that they're really gaining 0.12 strokes every time they hit driver. Multiply that by 14 drives in a round, and they're saving 1.74 strokes per round. That's a huge improvement for somebody at that level. The 15 handicap benefits even more. For every club they go down, we expect 0.108 fewer strokes to finish. Using that same math we just did a second ago for the 5 handicap, they're saving over 3 strokes per round just by hitting more driver. Finally, we have our 25 handicap. They're gaining 0.164 strokes for every club they drop. So again, we're going to do a little math over here, and we're going to see that they are saving over 4.5 strokes per round by hitting driver, not 3-wood. That's a huge improvement. That 25 handicap is on their way to being a sub 20 handicap just by making the right choice off the tee. Now we get to the second part of this argument, which is that the driver is actually not really less accurate than your 3-wood. Let's start with the simple science of the fact that this driver is the most forgiving club in your bag. It is the biggest, it is the most stable. The MOI in a driver can be as high as 10,000 grams per centimeter squared. The MOI in a 3-wood, by comparison, is typically less than half that of the average driver. So even if you think that you hit your 3-wood much, much better than your driver, it's probably not a big enough gap to negate that difference in stability and forgiveness. Now let's get to that shot scope data. Remember, this is across millions of shots, tens of thousands of golfers all over the world. What they've found is that for scratch players, they hit 1% more fairways with their 3-wood than with their driver. The 10 handicap hits 3% more fairways with their 3-wood than their driver. However, the 25 handicap hits 2% more fairways with their driver than with their 3-wood. That means on average, golfers hit 1% more fairways with their 3-wood than with their driver. So what does 1% mean? 1% more fairways means 1 extra fairway every 7 rounds. Now, let's go ahead and throw some numbers up here to quantify what that means. Let's start with the penalty that golfers pay for hitting it into the rough. With a wedge, pitching wedge, sand wedge, gap wedge, golfers hit about 11% fewer greens in reg from the rough than from the fairway. That's a big loss. And their average proximity to the hole goes up too, about 15 feet. They're hitting it 15 feet closer when they're in the fairway versus the rough. With a 6, 7, or 8 iron, that difference in greens and reg is only about 9%, but the proximity gap is a bit larger. But let's remember that every time I go down 2 clubs in terms of hitting my approach, which is what I should expect to do every time I hit driver, not 3-wood, I'm gaining as much as 13% odds of hitting that green and reg. So I'm actually coming out ahead, even on the holes where I hit it into the rough, not the fairway. And remember, I'm getting that 13% boost every time I hit my driver, not once every 7 rounds. If you think that hitting 1 more fairway every 7 rounds is a good trade compared to 26 yards on every tee shot, please let me know where we can play a match for all of your money against all of mine. Now we come to my favorite thing that I learned in all of this, and again, I want to thank ShotScope for all this data. Because you're sitting there saying, hitting fairways is great, but the real reason that I don't hit driver is because of penalty strokes. I'm an inaccurate driver and I want to keep my penalty strokes to a minimum. That's why I'm making the smart play and hitting 3-wood. ShotScope looked at penalty strokes incurred off the tee. For a 5 handicap, they incur penalty strokes on roughly 1% of their holes using driver and 1% of the holes when they use 3-wood. So for that 5 handicap, the driver is not more or less likely to create penalty strokes. Going to the other end of the spectrum, the 25 handicap, they get penalty strokes with their driver 3% of the time. When they hit 3-wood, they're getting penalty strokes 5% of the time. They are incurring more penalty strokes with their 3-wood than they are with their driver. The gap is even bigger when we look at those mid handicaps, the 15 handicaps. They incur penalty strokes with their driver just 2% of the time, but with their 3-wood, it's a full 5%. Golfers across the handicap spectrum are creating as many or more penalty strokes with their 3-wood as they are with their driver. So in summary, hit your driver off the tee more often. You are going to gain over 20 yards of distance compared to hitting 3-wood. you're going to hit about the same number of fairways, and you're likely to incur fewer penalty strokes. When you hit it longer off the tee, you're more likely to hit the green and reg. When you hit the green and reg more often, you're going to shoot lower scores. I want to thank you for watching this video, and if you enjoyed it, please leave a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel so you can stay up to date with all my latest content.